Classical Greece. The objectives are: 1. Examine the age of Pericles, when Athens became the center of Greek culture. And 2, analyze how the creation of an Athenian empire led to war with Sparta. Now, at the time that the Greeks had been expanding and settling, particularly along the Ionian coast, as classical Greece had begun to solidify in some sense, right on the cusp of this moment, we see the Greeks come into clash with the Persian Empire. Now, as the Greeks spread, they came into contact with the Persian Empire in the east. Particularly the Ionian Greeks led an unsuccessful revolt against Darius, the Persian ruler. Now, Darius had sent his troops into the Ionian coast to conquer that region. Now, it just so happened that the Greeks had been expanding eastward and the Persians had been expanding westward, and they came into conflict. Now, it was during this time that the Persians responded by the Ionian Greeks attempting to overthrow their rule. They attacked the Greeks themselves in the mainland at Marathon in 490 BCE. The Persians were defeated and victory was secured. However, it was here at this space that Darius had died, hearing the news after this failed invasion. And Xerxes, his son and heir, became the new monarch and vowed to avenge his father's defeat. Now, of course, the Persians were far too prideful or arrogant, or however you might imagine it, to allow the Greeks and their defeat to go unanswered. I mean, after all, the Persians had not thrown much of their military at the Greeks in the first place. And so the Greeks were really seen as a backwater people to the Persian Empire. They were significantly smaller. And so the Persians, under Xerxes' authority, set into motion a great conquest. Now, by the time the Persians invaded again, the Greeks had rebuilt their ships. And Xerxes led a massive invasion, estimated somewhere around 180,000 troops and thousands of warships to attack the Greeks. Now, there were two really major fronts to the battle. The first, of course, was the Pass of Thermopylae, and this was protected by 7,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. Now, of course, the 300 Spartans in myth have become those remembered only to hold the pass. But in the myth, in the story, the 300 Spartans had argued that millions had fought against them. This is, of course, in the account of Herodotus. And millions of Persians had gone up against them, and that they would fight in the shade of the arrows that they shot at them. This, of course, has been preserved in modern film as well, but there were 7,000 Greeks to hold this pass. Now, it was believed that this was never meant to be some kind of victory per se, but it was only meant to be a sort of strategy in which the rest of the Greeks would be rallied for a battle at sea. So the destruction of Athens followed after the Spartans had eventually been defeated at the Battle of Thermopylae. The destruction of Athens, the burning of Athens, resulted in the final battle that really turned the tide of the war at Salamis. Now, Salamis was a tight-quartered bay in which the Greeks, with their more maneuverable ships, could defeat the Persian ships. And this was really a major blow to the Persians, which was solidified in one battle after that, and this resulted in Xerxes and his troops fleeing into Persia, at least as some historians have categorized it. Some have said that Xerxes, of course, was called to deal with more important matters than the Greeks, but this is a matter of historical debate. Now, just to get an idea of the battles and the political history here, we see in the Ionian coast where this conflict began. And the green lines will show the Persians' march. The Persians crossed Anatolia, built a bridge of ships at the Hellespont, crossed through Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly, down into the Greek regions, and there Thermopylae was one of the major conflicts and battles. But it was at Salamis that we see the major turn of the battle. Now, after the Persians had left, the defeat of the Persians led to, ultimately, Athenian leadership. In 478 BCE, an alliance was created. The Delian League was fashioned to create a defensive network against the Persians. The fear was that the Persians would return once again. And so again, they needed to build more ships. They needed to equip themselves with larger armies. And so on the island of Delos, hence Delian League, was stored a great treasure. The Delian League went on to liberate all the Greek city-states in Asia Minor, but moved eventually the treasury to Athens. Now, of course, this, as you would imagine, would upset those that were part of the Delian League. The idea was that the Athenians needed to better safeguard the wealth that was sacrificed by the other Greek city-states for the protection. And so it turned to Athens to provide this protection. And under Pericles, Athens expanded its new empire abroad, and this expansion of Athens into this classical golden age was known as the Age of Pericles. Now, the Age of Pericles saw the explosion of what we would normally characterize as Greek culture. The Athenians became attached to their democratic system, and direct democracy cropped up. Direct democracy was the idea that the people participated directly in the government decision-making, not through proxy like as in the American democratic tradition, which is a republic as well. Now, most residents of Athens were not citizens and thus could not vote. Why? Because they held no political standing by not having property. And so, though you were a resident of Athens, it didn't necessarily mean that you were a citizen, and therefore, if not a citizen, then one could not vote. Now, the assembly passed all the laws and elected public officials. And 10 officials, were known as generals, were the overall directors of all policies. Now, the Athenians also devised the practice of ostracism, from the Greek word ostrakon. Now, an ostrakon here depicted was a bit of pottery that had been broken, and upon it was scrawled out or scratched out the name of a person. Now, how ostracism worked, as the English word from this word derives its meaning. If there were someone in the city whom people thought was a troublemaker or problem, they could bring it to a vote, and that they would scratch out in the assembly the name of someone who they believed should be ostracized or cast out of the city. And if enough votes were gathered, then the person would indeed be cast out. Of course, this is a similar method by which all direct democracy occurred, whether yes or no, through black or white rock, or various methods by which to gather the vote of the people. Athens then became the center of Greek culture in a true sense, at least as we remember it, and set into motion by Pericles massive rebuilding programs. Remember, under the Persians, their city had been destroyed, burned to the ground. And so under Pericles, using the wealth from the Delian League, rebuilt the city in a massive and glorious sort of classical Greek sense. But after the defeat of the Persians, two major camps emerged from the Delian League in general, and those who refused to participate, the Athenian Empire and Sparta. Everyone gathered around these two rallying flags. The two centers caused the outbreak of the great war that followed, the Great Peloponnesian War in 431 BCE. The Athenians planned to remain behind its city walls, ultimately, after great skirmishes and battles. The Spartans had cornered them in their own city, and the idea was to hold them out. But Sparta and our allies surrounded Athens such that plague broke out eventually, and putting an end to the Athenian resistance after 25 years, even Pericles himself fell victim to the plague. So the next 66 years, Sparta and Athens and Thebes sought to dominate Greek affairs and fought with each other and squabbled with each other, but all the while a new power, the Macedonian power, which wasn't technically Greek in the first place, arose in the north and came to dominate politics. Now here you can see the Peloponnesian War in this infograph. You can see the Athenians and their allies in the purple, Sparta and her allies in the Greek, and then those neutral states who wanted to not get involved. Now here then we can see the conflict that arose. And it's interesting that the Persians never bothered to come back. They were embroiled in other political affairs. But after that great war, they spiraled into their own conflict with one another. Now, what did daily life in classical Athens look like? Now, slavery was, of course, common in the ancient world. It was, when we talk about slavery, we can't think about a modern American remembrance of slavery. This is not the sort of slavery that we're talking about. It's not race-based slavery. Most Athenians owned at least one slave, but it wasn't necessarily based on one's skin color. Most slaves in Athens worked in the fields or in the home as cooks and maids, and this slavery was not based on race, in part, but culture and wealth. So we see the example of the Helots, for example. When the Spartans conquered them, they were slaves in some sense, but they were Greeks themselves, right? So this wasn't a racial thing. No one looked at one's skin color and said, you are inferior as a person, and so you should be enslaved. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Greeks didn't make fun of other people. If you weren't Greek, you were laughable. And so, often enough, some people were used as caricatures for humor. However, the traditional African, for example, here depicted in a statue, were popular as acrobats and boxers, and many people lauded their skills. So it didn't necessarily mean that they couldn't be incorporated into Greek society. Now, the Athenian economy in general was an economy of farming and trade, as in many Greek city-states sought to pursue, particularly among the cash crops. The cash crops in the Mediterranean in general were grapes and olives. Olives for oil, grapes for wine. And so Athens began to grow cash crops and didn't, in fact, grow much of their own food source, grain, for example. Athens imported 50 to 80% of its grain, the basic diet of those who lived within their walls and within their region. They imported it from other regions, other breadbasket regions, probably from the Black Sea or Egypt even. It was much cheaper for them because they had an explosion in wealth from growing grapes and growing olives. Now, the building eventually of the port city of Piraeus helped the Athenians become a leading trade center in the 5th century. The Piraeus, of course, allowed Athens to become its own port city, even though Athens itself is not at a port. And they had, in fact, a tunnel that led straight from Piraeus to Athens to protect against the sort of siege warfare that might occur. And so it allowed Athens to be connected to the Mediterranean. So here we can see kind of a infograph showing the relationship between Athens and Piraeus. Now, the family and the role of women in Greek society was also an important factor to be mentioned. The family's primary social function was to produce new citizens. This is how people thought about family in the Greek society. Family was those responsible for producing, not just biologically, but through education, new citizens to lead the city to its next generation. Women, of course, could not own property. We've seen this in other places. For example, China, which is an interesting cross comparison on both the contrast and similarities. So beyond personal items and those sorts of things, always supervised by male guardians, these women had to be supervised and watched, made sure that they weren't acting out of turn. So this is largely a patriarchal society in a true sense. And women's chief obligation was to bear children, especially male children. That was the goal, to produce a male heir. And she did the household work, or supervised slaves that did the household work. And so the domain of the woman had been confined to the home space in Greek culture. This is a tendency that we'll see in Western society and in other regions as we move forward. Now, the objectives, again, were first, examine the age of Pericles, when Athens became the center of Greek culture. That is the result of the Persian conflict, the Persian Wars. And second, analyze how the creation of an Athenian empire led to war with Sparta. That is the Peloponnesian War, and that conflict over who would dominate the Greek world.